The darkness descended upon the ravaged perimeter of the pocket like a weighty shroud laden with coal particles, the odor of scorched petroleum, and the anxious silence that accompanies excessive days of military collapse. Within a drafty livestock shelter, hurriedly transformed into a detention facility, a collection of German support personnel, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and scarcely warmed beneath threadbare coverings, anticipated a sunrise they presumed would mark their final moments. The planks overhead groaned with the wind, each moan reverberating like a forewarning. Somebody adjusted position on the hay-strewn floor, releasing minute particles of debris floating through slender beams of lunar illumination that pierced the gloom. Close by, a woman murmured a devotional phrase beneath her respiration, the syllables quavering in the frigid atmosphere. Another individual, rocking herself gradually, strengthened her grasp on a compact journal she had maintained since her instruction period, though she possessed nothing remaining to inscribe within its pages. Every countenance displayed the identical unvoiced terror that daybreak would deliver, the resonance of marching feet, bellowed instructions, and the conclusive punctuation to a conflict numerous among them never desired to participate in. Nobody understood what the Americans positioned outside genuinely planned. Speculation had supplanted certainty, and apprehension had supplanted slumber. Even the most youthful among them had extensively ceased posing reassuring inquiries. For countless hours, the shelter had been a repository of conjecture. Some maintained the Americans were compassionate, that their protocols originated from voluminous regulation manuscripts and martial tribunal warnings. Others indicated the pandemonium tearing throughout Germany, contending that regulations no longer retained significance, that combatants hardened by months of savage confrontation now functioned on primitive impulse. A woman designated Marta asserted she received information from a withdrawing infantryman that female support personnel connected to transmission divisions were regarded as espionage agents. Another individual had received the contrary intelligence. Americans demonstrated indifference regarding individual identities, only that the hostilities were terminating. None of these propositions alleviated the anxiety threading throughout the chamber. Every creak of the shelter entrance, every whisper from the sentries positioned externally, transmitted ripples of terror across the women assembled along the barriers, their garments formerly pressed and orderly, now suspended loosely on shoulders that had transported excessive burden in the preceding 3 weeks. Soil hardened surrounding their footwear, fingerprints stained the gray woolen sleeves, and the emblems that formerly defined their functions now appeared like meaningless fabric fragments. What retained importance was continuation, and sunrise positioned itself as an obstruction, like an imminent pronouncement. Anna, one of the senior support personnel at 29 years, positioned herself near the rear section of the shelter, her dorsal area compressed against a frigid wooden support. She had functioned as a wireless operator in a disintegrating field command center, tracing desperate transmissions across humming frequencies until everything dissolved into quietude. Her extremities still twitched periodically, as if extending toward apparatus no longer present. She observed the others through partially closed eyelids, examining their agitated movements, their whispered debates, their strained facial features. Though she possessed no formal command presently, some intuition nudged her into a subdued leadership capacity, offering composed glances when alarm rippled excessively loudly. Opposite her, positioned Elise, only 19 years, who had enlisted with the support personnel, aspiring to become a medical practitioner. The conflict had bestowed her minimal beyond depletion. She attached herself to Anna like a younger sibling, detecting in her steadiness a delicate anchor against hopelessness. When Elise ultimately vocalized, her articulation fractured. "Do you genuinely believe they'll execute it at sunrise?" Anna wavered, reluctant to fabricate, yet reluctant to obliterate the spark of expectation in the adolescent's vision. "Speculation isn't directives," she responded tenderly, "and sunrise arrives, whether we apprehend it or otherwise." Both comprehended that wasn't a resolution. It was merely something to maintain grasp upon. Beyond the shelter barriers, the Americans maintained surveillance beneath a dim atmosphere radiating faintly from remote conflagrations, still consuming in the devastation. Their silhouettes maneuvered with gradual, calculated paces, firearms suspended casually, exhalation visible in the penetrating atmosphere. The women positioned internally, incapable of perceiving their countenances, envisioned severe expressions and indifferent apathy in equivalent proportion. Periodically, an American sentinel muttered something in English, brief expressions the detainees couldn't comprehend. One of the women, who had formerly courted a technician from Hamburg who examined English, exerted effort to capture recognizable vocabulary, but captured only portions. It demonstrated no significance. Vocabulary could not protect them from whatever transpired subsequently. In the sporadic quietness, artillery resonated miles distant like a diminishing tempest, reluctantly transporting itself across the skyline. The battle line had progressed onward, but reverberations of its violence persisted. Even the terrain appeared restless. As the hours advanced forward, the shelter's interior transformed from frigid quietness to subdued revelations. Some women distributed narratives of their households left behind. Others acknowledged they had enlisted with the support personnel, not from allegiance, but for sustenance allocations or departure from industrial labor. A few wept gently, not from apprehension exclusively, but from the liberation of maintaining sorrow excessively firmly for excessive duration. There existed a peculiar closeness in the atmosphere, a variety it materializes when individuals presume they position themselves on the boundary of something conclusive. Elise disclosed she had never witnessed genuine combat injuries despite her medical instruction, only frozen tissue and stress-provoked unconsciousness. Another woman articulated about her residential community bakery, describing the fragrance of grain bread ascending from heating chambers on Sabbath mornings. Anna absorbed all of their words, assimilating their utterances like diminutive lanterns flickering in a shadowed expanse. Distributed recollections didn't modify their circumstances, but they diminished the severity forming surrounding their cardiac organs. It was less difficult to confront terror when it possessed recognizable articulations attached. 1 hour preceding sunrise, the shelter momentarily descended into quietness as the resonance of a motor sputtered proximately. Gravel compressed beneath wheels, metal collided against timber. Somebody inhaled sharply. Somebody else whispered, "They're approaching." The women straightened instinctively, some grasping extremities, others organizing their coverings with quivering exactness, as if orderliness could somehow protect them. Elise compressed her shoulder against Anna's, and Anna responded by positioning a stabilizing extremity over the younger woman's digits. Footwear impacted externally, accompanied by the subdued murmur of masculine articulations. The entrance vibrated. Uncertainty spiraled firmly in every thorax. A collective respiration maintained captive. Even the atmospheric current appeared to suspend, anticipating. Minutes transpired, then additional. The footfalls withdrew marginally, supplanted by indistinct conversation. A sentinel expelled air from lungs. Another expressed amusement quietly at something, the pressure in the shelter suspended like a cutting instrument. Every moment stretched agonizingly, incapable of offering alleviation. Anna compelled herself to inhale gradually, extracting the frigid atmosphere profoundly into her respiratory organs until she experienced it, puncture. She reminded herself that apprehension, abandoned unchecked, could disassemble her from internally more rapidly than any adversary. She contemplated briefly of her younger sibling, detained near a location months previously. If he endured, he might position himself in an enclosure identical to this one. She pondered whether he confronted the identical terror of an uncertain sunrise. That contemplation, unexpected, establishing, softened something in her. Progressively, conversations resumed in diminutive concentrations. One woman attempted to express humor weakly that Americans presumably expended more duration consuming than executing detainees. A few compelled expressions of amusement flickered surrounding her, delicate sparks attempting to eliminate the obscurity. Another woman contended that if terminations were arranged, the sentries wouldn't appear so tranquil. Yet another contradicted that presentations signified nothing throughout wartime. Each proposition spiraled into another until conjecture depleted itself. Ultimately, the shelter drifted into a delicate motionlessness, not harmonious, but resigned. Sunrise approached like an unavoidable surge, its pale radiance commencing to thin the obscurity at the remote boundaries of the barriers. When the initial faint streak of illumination penetrated through the fractures in the shelter entrance, a subdued murmur ascended from the women. Some inclined their craniums, others elevated their facial features defiantly, selecting courage as their conclusive gesture. Anna strengthened her grasp on Elise's extremity, silently, assuring the adolescent she wouldn't confront whatever arrived independently. Externally, the motor sputtered again, more audibly this instance. Articulations sharpened, a metal fastening scraped against timber, the shelter entrance trembled once and twice. Every cardiac pulsation in the chamber synchronized, substantial and audible. Sunrise had materialized. Assessment followed with substantial footfalls. And as the entrance commenced to oscillate open, gradual, calculated, unmistakable, the women prepared for the destiny apprehension had carved so distinctly in their cognitions, unaware that what positioned anticipating beyond the threshold was not the termination they apprehended, but something so commonplace, so unexpectedly human, that it would disintegrate every certainty they had transported through the extensive and terrible darkness. The shelter entrance oscillated open with a jolt that transmitted a frigid surge of terror through the women. Illumination flooded inward. Not the severe blaze of firearm barrels or the blinding radiance of interrogation, illumination devices, but the gentle, almost indifferent radiance of an ascending solar body settling over American garments. The combatants framed in the entrance did not assault internally. Instead, they positioned themselves casually, as if materializing for a mundane assignment rather than executing a termination. One, a substantial man with a circular countenance half obscured beneath his protective headgear, adjusted a wooden container in his extremities and muttered something to the combatant beside him. Another individual yawned. The unexpected conventionality of their positioning astonished the detainees more than any demonstration of aggression could have. For a moment, nobody maneuvered. Even the sentries positioned externally appeared uncertain whether to advance with gentleness or command. Ultimately, the circular countenance combatant stepped forward, positioned the container downward, and elevated both extremities, not in caution, but in a gentle gesture of tranquility. Elise instinctively strengthened her grasp on Anna's extremity. She had anticipated firearm apertures and bellowed instructions, not men transporting containers like merchants delivering commodities. Anna experienced the adolescent's quivering and confronted her own bewilderment. Nothing about the spectacle aligned with their apprehensions. The Americans did not appear victorious or merciless. They appeared exhausted, almost indifferent, as though sunrise terminations were the most distant consideration from their cognitions. The combatant at the frontal area glanced surrounding the shelter before articulating in carefully calculated German, advising the women to maintain seated positions. His pronunciation bent the vocabulary peculiarly, but the intonation was unmistakably tender. A ripple of disbelief swept throughout the assembly. Nobody dared trust it completely. 2 additional Americans entered, transporting supplementary containers, one of which vibrated gently with metal cylinders. Another maintained a metal vessel that liberated a faint fragrance of something warm, something unmistakably consumable. The women exchanged bewildered glances, each silently inquiring the others if they were perceiving what they presumed they were perceiving. Elise whispered, "Are they providing sustenance to us?" The inquiry suspended in the atmosphere like an impossible contemplation. Anna examined the combatants' countenances, investigating for indications of deception or concealed cruelty. She discovered none. If anything, the men appeared concentrated purely on their assignment, determined on organizing the provisions as productively as possible. The interpreter materialized moments subsequently, a youthful German-American with a rigid positioning and a countenance captured between compassion and professionalism. He introduced himself abruptly, informing the women that they were presently officially detainees of conflict and would be processed according to United States military protocols. His vocabulary descended into the shelter like a mineral that descended gradually through liquid. Detainees of conflict. The expression resonated almost merciful. The women, still anticipating the most severe, anticipated some concealed distortion. Instead, the youthful interpreter instructed them to establish diminutive assemblies so the combatants could distribute morning sustenance. That sentence, elementary, almost casual, transported more emotional burden than any reassurance he could have presented. The circular countenanced combatant accessed the initial container. Internally positioned accumulations of white grain sandwiches enclosed in flimsy waxed material alongside cylinders of dairy spread, and diminutive chocolate portions. The perception of sustenance, genuine sustenance, not speculation or recollections, transmitted an electric shock throughout the shelter. One of the senior women liberated a resonance halfway between a sob and an expression of amusement. Another concealed her oral cavity as tears accumulated in her vision. The Americans, oblivious to the emotional devastation unfolding in frontal position of them, transported onward with their procedure. One combatant apologized through the interpreter that the sandwiches were nothing exceptional. The irony of that understatement extracted a trembling expression of amusement from Anna. The absurd juxtaposition between the women's apprehension and the combatants' matter-of-fact hospitality experienced almost surreal. As the women received their allocations, hesitation attached to every maneuver. Elise accepted her sandwich with both extremities as though apprehensive it might evaporate. For a moment she merely observed it, her respiration trembling. Then she directed her vision upward at Anna, alleviation blossoming across her countenance. The transformation was subdued but profound. Apprehension diminished its grasp, if only marginally. Anna consumed gradually, experiencing each portion as though attempting to relearn the act of trusting the environment surrounding her. The grain was arid, the filling unremarkable, yet it experienced like the most meaningful consumption she had consumed in months. The combatants continued distributing allocations, their procedure steady and almost ritualistic. Their demeanor disclosed no malevolence, only responsibility. They articulated to each other in subdued articulations, periodically glancing at the women with inquisitiveness, but never antagonism. The interpreter clarified that once morning sustenance was completed, the detainees would be maneuvered to transportation vehicles for conveyance to a provisional processing location. The intelligence stimulated a murmur of uncertainty. The contemplation of another journey in an unknown orientation revived former anxieties. Yet the presence of the sandwiches, the tranquil intonation of the combatants, and the absence of armaments indicated at them diminished the impact. One American, observing Elise struggling to access her cylinder of dairy, positioned himself on knee level and wordlessly presented his pocket-cutting instrument. Startled, she inclined and accepted the assistance. The interaction persisted mere moments, but its symbolism descended substantially among the women. Acts of savagery they had apprehended, all darkness dissolved beneath the burden of uncommonplace kindness. Their terror commenced to appear in retrospect, like a merciless shadow projected by depletion and misinformation. Even so, uncertainty persisted. Anna experienced it gnawing internally, an articulation whispering that compassion could deteriorate without caution. She observed every detail, the combatants' tranquil stances, the deficiency of urgency in their maneuvers, the absence of any termination implements or arrangement. Progressively, her skepticism diminished its maintenance. If the Americans arranged violence, they concealed it remarkably competently. Something internally her, deteriorated but not extinguished, commenced to stimulate. When the combatants completed distributing sustenance, the interpreter announced the transportation vehicles would materialize soon, the shelter occupied with a subdued transformation in vitality. Not entirely alleviation, not entirely resignation, but something suspended between. Elise compressed Anna's extremity again, though this instance the quivering was gentler. Externally, a motor resonated to vitality. The women elevated their craniums as one, absorbing sound. The resonance expanded closer, accompanied by the compression of gravel and the murmur of novel articulations. Whatever anticipated beyond the shelter was approaching for them. But this instance, sunrise no longer experienced like a pronouncement. It experienced like the commencement of an unexpected section, one none of them were prepared to trust, yet could no longer contradict. And as the shadow of the approaching transportation vehicle stretched across the threshold, Anna detected that the genuine disclosure had not yet materialized. The transportation vehicles jolted forward with a resonance that vibrated throughout the wooden platforms, trembling loose portions of dried soil from the women's footwear as they attached to the lateral railings for equilibrium. The open-backed mechanisms maneuvered gradually initially, weaving between demolished agricultural structures and the skeletal remnants of artillery positions, abandoned only days previously. Frigid morning atmosphere whipped past them, transporting the metallic fragrance of scorched machinery and the faint pleasantness of seasonal soil beneath the devastation. Anna positioned herself near the rear corner, one extremity surrounding Elise to stabilize her. Each instance the transportation vehicle bounced over debris. Though the terror of termination had diminished, a novel unease had supplanted it, an unease constructed not on apprehension of imminent death, but on the uncertainty of what arrived subsequently. The Americans had astonished them once already. Nobody comprehended if their compassion maintained limitations. As the convoy descended a narrow inclination, the women captured a glimpse of a devastated valley dotted with fleeing civilians and loose wagons. American combatants guided assemblies of detained German infantry towards separate detention areas, while engineers cleared collapsed bridges. Everything maneuvered with abrupt coordination. Elise whispered that she had never envisioned an occupying aggression could appear so systematic, almost indifferent to the pandemonium surrounding them. Anna inclined, observing the combatants' calculated maneuvers. Conflict for them appeared like a massive apparatus, one they maintained without emotional burden. The perception unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she could comprehend, but tranquil productivity in the midst of destruction, experienced peculiarly alien. After nearly 1 hour, the transportation vehicles rotated toward an open expanse bordered by strands of recent barbed wire and guarded observation structures. A concentration of shelters ballooned gently in the atmospheric current, their canvas exteriors stained from precipitation and particles. American military police waved the convoy into a designated zone. As the mechanisms halted, directives were issued in firm but calculated English, followed by translations bellowed by the interpreter riding in the rear transportation vehicle. The women were instructed to disembark gradually, establish 3 formations, and anticipate further instructions. They complied with rigid caution, anticipating sudden antagonism. Instead, they were encountered with documentation. A folding surface had been established near the entrance where 2 administrative personnel positioned beneath a marker labeled Provisional Processing Female Division. The administrators, both youthful men with perspiration-darkened collars, directed vision upward periodically as the women approached, but mostly concentrated on typing personal details into portable field typewriters. The rhythmic percussion of mechanisms experienced absurdly domestic compared to the conflict-deteriorated countenances of the detainees. Elise blinked at the spectacle, whispering that she had anticipated interrogation, not registration. Anna, stepping forward when her rotation arrived, responded each inquiry gradually, her articulation calculated. Designation, age, division, final assignment. The administrator barely directed vision at her while inscribing, suspending only to adjust the ribbon on his apparatus. Once processed, the women were oriented toward a more substantial shelter, where medical personnel conducted brief examinations. A medical practitioner with rolled sleeves checked digits for frozen tissue and absorbed to cardiac pulsations with a listening instrument that had distinctly endured years of utilization. Another medical specialist recorded symptoms in a journal. The Americans maneuvered with practiced neutrality, presenting no assessment, only productivity. When Elise wavered at the entrance, overwhelmed by the sudden closeness of the procedure, the medical practitioner articulated to her in elementary, reassuring German. Just an examination, nothing additional. Elise tranquil, though her facial features flushed with embarrassment. Internally, the shelter, the women encountered a diminutive heating apparatus radiating pleasant warmth. The sensation of thermal energy on their countenances triggered a surge of unexpected emotion. Some expressed amusement shyly, grateful for the brief comfort. Others diminished their vision, reluctant to permit humanity to diminish their protections excessively rapidly. Anna observed these reactions with expanding awareness. It was becoming distinct that the Americans were not interested in punishing them. The organization surrounding them existed to categorize, not condemn. Still, an inquiry persisted. For what duration would such civility persist? After medical examinations, the women were escorted to their designated compound, an area enclosed by barbed wire, but deficient the oppressive substantial nature they associated with detention enclosures. Within the perimeter positioned several extensive shelters lined with platforms, each supplied with thin coverings. A few American combatants positioned sentinel, but their expressions disclosed indifference rather than malevolence. One paced gradually, periodically propelling a mineral, as if confronting monotony. Another inclined against a vertical support, inscribing something in a diminutive journal. The mundane character of their demeanor created a peculiar dissonance. The environment external, the barrier was disintegrating, yet internally vitality maneuvered with almost bureaucratic tranquility. As the women established into the shelter, they discovered a makeshift washing location, supplying frigid but clean liquid. The opportunity to cleanse soil from their countenances experienced like a present, though numerous wavered, uncertain whether the privilege arrived with concealed conditions. Anna approached initially, immersing her extremities into the metal container. The glacial shock startled her, but the sensation revived her clarity. Elise followed, splashing liquid over her facial features, expressing amusement quietly when droplets descended onto her collar. The elementary act of cleansing themselves rendered the women experience momentarily human again, as though they were stepping external of the shadow of apprehension that had defined their recent days. Midday sustenance materialized shortly after. Metal vessels of coffee, preserved fruit, and crackers distributed by two combatants who presented brief, courteous inclinations. One of them, a red-haired man with facial pigmentation spots, attempted articulating to the women in fragmented German. His clumsy grammar delivered an involuntary expression of amusement to several countenances. When he recognized his mistake in confusing the vocabulary for covering with equine, he flushed and attempted an apology that only deepened the awkward charm of the moment. Anna discovered herself expressing amusement beneath her respiration, astonished at the resonance. She had forgotten what amusement experienced like. Over the subsequent hours, the women progressively comprehended the structure of the American organization. They were to maintain in the provisional enclosure until conveyance to a more substantial processing facility, deeper within Allied-controlled territory. The Americans extracted designations daily, examined head tallies, and maintained strict schedules. Yet the regulations were predictable, the discipline consistent. Nobody bellowed unnecessarily. Nobody transported themselves with the swagger of conquerors. The sentries merely executed their responsibilities. Some women commenced to tranquil. Others, however, expanded more anxious. Among them was Hilda, a former teletypist with acute features and a guarded demeanor. She confided to Anna that she apprehended the Americans might separate them eventually, perhaps identifying some as suspicious or politically dangerous. "We don't comprehend their criteria," Hilda whispered. "Kindness presently doesn't guarantee kindness subsequently." Anna couldn't contradict, though she discovered comfort in the American's demeanor. She comprehended Hilda's suspicion had origins in actuality. Conflict reshaped regulations rapidly. As evening approached, the women assembled external their shelter, observing the solar body descend behind remote hills. The atmosphere radiated with shades of orange and diminishing gold, projecting extensive shadows across the enclosure. The atmosphere transported the subdued vibration of generators and the remote conversation of American combatants, distributing expressions of amusement beside a provisioned transportation vehicle. Elise inclined against Anna's shoulder, murmuring that the peacefulness experienced unreal, like an illusion that might dissolve if they blinked excessively firmly. Anna agreed silently. The day had delivered safety, but safety experienced delicate. Just preceding nightfall, a military police approached the compound alongside the interpreter. He transported a clipboard and examined the formations of women with a contemplative expression. Without presenting clarification, he instructed them to assemble near the entrance at initial illumination. A novel conveyance was scheduled. Specifics would be presented in the morning. His intonation disclosed nothing. No antagonism, no reassurance, only procedure. As he rotated distant, Elise exhaled sharply, her previous tranquility flickering. Anna observed the military police ambulate rearward toward the administrative shelter, her abdominal region tightening once additional. Uncertainty returned like a shadow, stretching across the terrain. The Americans had presented them sustenance, protection, and dignity, but the conflict's apparatus continued to maneuver surrounding them, indifferent to individual destiny. Whatever anticipated at sunrise would extract them deeper into an organization they barely comprehended. And as the initial celestial bodies kindled above the enclosure, Anna detected that the genuine evaluation of her composure and the women's delicate expectation was only commencing. Morning advanced across the more substantial processing enclosure with a pale diluted illumination that diminished nothing, yet disclosed everything. Formations of shelters positioned in disciplined arrangement, their canvas exteriors fluttering gently in the restless atmospheric current drifting from the major waterway. The women from the smaller compound, presently conveyed deeper into Allied-controlled territory, stepped onto solid terrain with a mixture of fatigue and sharpened awareness. They had anticipated a more severe environment, perhaps a location reverberating the cruelty whispered throughout wartime speculation, but the enclosure experienced peculiarly functional, almost impersonal. American combatants maneuvered along distinctly marked pathways, their footwear compressing in rhythmic patterns, their expressions tranquil, neither antagonistic nor welcoming. Anna examined them closely, attempting to decipher whether this novel location maintained greater risk or unexpected compassion. Elise persisted near her lateral position, absorbing the unfamiliar surroundings, with wide vision that disclosed both alleviation and the persistent quivering of uncertainty. Processing commenced almost immediately, though it unfolded with the identical methodical sequence the women were commencing to recognize as the American signature. They were oriented to separate locations for clothing examinations, identity confirmation, and another brief health inspection. At each position, the combatants interacted with them as though handling routine assignments rather than confronting former adversaries. This conventionality unsettled Elise, who whispered to Anna that she apprehended being overlooked entirely, as if their suffering might evaporate internally, an administrative ledger. Anna comprehended the sentiment. Anonymity presented safety, but it also erased the intense emotions that had defined their journey. Still, she observed diminutive gestures that fragmented distant at her persisting distrust. A combatant adjusting a shelter, covering to obstruct the atmospheric current. Another presenting liquid without prompting. Such moments created a subdued juxtaposition to the savagery numerous had received information about on the eastern battle line, where compassion was a rarity buried beneath cycles of vengeance. Subsequently in the afternoon, the women were escorted to a more substantial recreation area, a section of open terrain where detainees were permitted to maneuver freely beneath watchful vision. Some masculine detainees assembled near the remote barrier, exchanging muted remarks as the female assembly approached. The Americans maintained strict separation, yet the perception of distributed defeat suspended in the atmosphere like a thin mist. Elise glanced nervously at the remote figures, but Anna reassured her with a gentle contact, detecting that the enclosure's structure relied substantially on procedure and regulation rather than intimidation. The women positioned together beneath an arboreal specimen, stripped bare by artillery shock surges, its fragmented branches projecting jagged shadows across the dusty soil. Here, conversations emerged more openly. Some articulated of households, others of the moment they surrendered, each recollection tinged with depletion. Anna observed that even Hilda, usually guarded, appeared to respire more freely in this diminished space. As evening extracted closer, the women were summoned for another briefing, this one delivered by a middle-aged commanding officer with reading optical instruments perched precariously on his nasal feature, clarified the subsequent stage in their processing. They would soon be conveyed to a more permanent facility, where they would maintain until formal evaluations determining their classification. The commanding officer emphasized that women accused of no violations would confront only routine internment. His intonation transported the burden of protocol rather than menace. Yet the announcement rekindled pressure among the detainees. Elise grasped Anna's sleeve, envisioning remote enclosures occupied with endless formations of wire and sentries. Anna, however, discovered herself considering something different. How consistently the Americans had demonstrated demeanor, how their regulations appeared to override emotion. Predictability presented a delicate comfort. Even so, she pondered what this novel facility might demand of them, and whether they would be permitted to maintain together. Darkness established gradually over the enclosure, organizing the compound into muted shades of blue and gray. Lanterns flickered near the administrative shelter, projecting warm halos onto the soil, while remote expressions of amusement from American combatants drifted across the barriers, peculiarly gentle in the motionless atmosphere. The women positioned together along the boundary of their enclosure, each transporting her own mixture of apprehension, depletion, and reluctant expectation. Elise inclined against Anna's shoulder, confessing that she no longer comprehended what to presume. She had expended so numerous darknesses preparing for violence that the sudden presence of structure and compassion experienced unreal. Anna absorbed quietly, her cognition tracing every detail of the past days, From the terror in the shelter, to the sandwiches, to the systematic procedures that appeared almost incapable of cruelty. She did not trust blindly, but she recognized patterns, and the American's demeanor followed one unmistakable rhythm, discipline anchored by humanity. Even Hilda, though still exhausted, acknowledged the actuality with a grudging exhalation. The enclosure was not paradise, but it was not the nightmare she apprehended. Yet, as the darkness deepened, Anna detected the tranquility thinning, as though the enclosure itself maintained its respiration. Conflict had instructed her that tranquility often concealed transforming terrain. She ascended and maneuvered toward the barrier, observing the sentinel silhouettes pacing in gradual, steady formations. Their maneuvers appeared unchanged, firearms loose at their lateral positions, but something in their positioning hinted at anticipation. Elise joined her quietly and inquired if she presumed morning would deliver another transformation. Anna wavered, uncertain which response presented more comfort. Before she articulated, a military transportation mechanism vibrated toward the administrative shelter, its frontal illumination devices carving acute pathways throughout the dimness. Two commanding officers stepped external, articulating in clipped intonations that transported unmistakable urgency. Moments subsequently, the interpreter emerged, summoned abruptly, his expression tense. A concentration of combatants assembled near the shelter entrance, their countenances illuminated by an oscillating lantern. The women observed in uneasy quietness, exerting effort to interpret every gesture. Then Anna observed one commanding officer maintaining a packet of folders marked with red tags, documents utilized only for conveyances requiring exceptional authorization. Her pulsation strengthened. Something consequential was forming in shadows beyond their extension, something positioned to redirect the delicate trajectory of their days. When the commanding officer ultimately rotated toward the women's compound, expression grave but steady, Anna comprehended that compassion, while genuine, would not protect them from whatever arrived subsequently. And in that moment, uncertainty returned with a burden none of them could disregard.